So I've talked about this twice before, the idea that defense firms aren't as dangerous as people think, and certainly, in my view, not as dangerous or as ever-looming a threat as industries which are necessary constantly in really short-term, incessant bursts. Industries that deal in energy, food, clean water, medicine, sewage, that sort of stuff. That isn't to say that defense isn't just as important, just as consequential, if not more consequential than these industries. I'd be foolish to deny that, but it is to suggest that defense isn't as constant or as direct or as common a threat. The timescale is slightly larger for protection, for the moving out of the old and the moving in of the new. Energy is needed in constant supply, but one can keep a backlog of certain weapon systems, certain protective systems that remain there inherently, and that can serve their purpose for a longer time. Whereas, if you, let's say, cut a load of interconnectors that come to the UK, and then turn off all of the power in the UK, you have a very big issue very quickly. So I thought I might come up with a system for classifying this, because not all of these firms are equal. Not all of these firms that have influence are equal. And I didn't come up with the naming system. I was writing this over breakfast. I went down a little bit early, and some of the people who I dined with at breakfast in younger years thought it would be a good idea to name each of these after some sort of African savanna animal for some reason. But anyway, so I'm going to be talking about this system effectively. It doesn't merely deal in the vagueness, the abstract of security, but those industries which have power, both constantly and inconstantly in different time frames, of great consequence and of little, although of great consequence when put in sum. All of the other attributes that we need to identify in order to say what the effect or potential effect of certain industries is. So, before I start, I think it's important to point out that for defense firms being public, and I've talked about this before, the last one, and for the potential for them to put a spanner in the works through some sort of nefarious power grab, evil move, I do find it rather ironic, even considering this classification system, that a lot of people instantaneously switch from the opinion that defense firms are evil, something to destroy, something that we'd be better off without, as entities which produce the most heinous solutions that the market has ever seen, and all of the solutions should, in their eyes, be strapped to a rocket, sent to deep space, never to be seen again. But as soon as it's mentioned how some of these firms may have interruptions to their supply, of aforementioned apparent mechanical, electronic monstrosities of death that they attribute these firms, death and destruction, the very same people become concerned for the state of the nation and call for further production. And I think the same is true for a lot of these certain classifications. A lot of people do say that there are large issues, but ramping down production basically makes an issue. There may be problems with it, and a lot of people say that the answer is to reduce the number of firms within this market because of the power they have, but because of perhaps the negative impact they have, the externalities, as it were, negative production and consumption. But the constant is that they do generally switch their position when they find out that these industries are in jeopardy. And that tells us something interesting, not only about these people, but about the industries, that they are of real consequence. And even those who identify them as not ideal, as something which should be stopped, recognize that consequence, recognize that importance. I understand the viewpoint of pacifism, particularly for defense, the idea of getting rid of all security systems, defense firms, manufacturers worldwide. Nonetheless, the very same people generally who suggest a nation should defang and declaw itself are the ones who are least likely to bark before they bite when any sort of real conflict breaks out. In any case, I think that's true with a lot of these, so I'll actually get to it and start from the bottom up. Industries which are common and of relatively little consequence, but still have a profound impact on society when they are lacking. So this can be something as seemingly important as food firms, and seemingly inconsequential as pubs. The fact of the matter is that individually, these firms do not have profound social or societal, at least, impact. They don't have the ability to create negative repercussions within society. If the local pub closes down, it might be a shame, but it's not going to ruin the country. But when combined, they have a real effect on society, and that actually leads to breakdown. In regard to the inconsequence, seemingly, of pubs, they seem unnecessary. Certainly not comparable to food, water, ammunition, things needed for basic survival. But for society, it's really death by 1,000 cuts, the loss of these sort of habits, as it were. We saw in the prohibition of the USA that civil unrest can occur pretty quickly from it, and I maintain that the same is true of rich tea biscuits and Jaffa cakes. I think, and a lot of economists would largely agree, that if hops farms die out, so we can't produce beer, if the vines don't have a great yield this year, and there is no wine, if there isn't enough peat to heat the scotch this year, then society begins to lose that which we've become accustomed to. In much the same way, if the strawberries aren't as plump as the usual ones, then jammy Dodger yield diminishes. If the chocolate is poorly mixed, if there's not quite enough cacao to support the plant, then Jaffa cakes can't be made. Or if there's too little flour, or the flour's too thick, then we can't produce enough rich tea biscuits. Unless there are extraneous circumstances that make people pull together to bind, then society begins to fall apart. I don't know really how one can define these comforts as culture, custom. I really don't have a clue. But I can say that without them, society does slowly disintegrate, and that is more consequential, more important than people actually give these industries credit for. In a military context, we might say that morale begins to fail. In a civilian context, just as in a military context, this leads to the reduction of productivity. It leads to... I was talking to an economist who put it quite well. He said something along the lines of, it's the absence of the breaths we get through the rough currents of the world, which basically pull us to lows. And while these firms do very little on their own, together, the social impact is huge and unexpected. It's unpredictable. I'll dub these industries, or rather, the younger boys did, the honeybee industries. They give us a taste of sweetness. And alone they do very little, but swarmed can produce havoc. Next is what was dubbed the water buffalo. Industries that are reasonably inconsequential alone, that tend to stick to themselves. The fooling of it, though, the failing of the industry itself, leads to the collapse of key infrastructure functioning within society. For this, I might consider the cobalt market. That's quite a good one. So when there is a low cobalt yield, or there's an issue with the supply chain in a year, that means that there's difficulty making electronic components. And this drives up the price of all rare earths together. And actually, a lot of people stockpile cobalt. They stockpile rare earths. And that creates huge issues. Everyone gets scared. They buy up huge inventory for manufacturing. And that means no one else can manufacture anything. The fundamental concept: one buffalo bolts, one industry bolts, and the rest follow. Next, I'll deal with one I've already dealt with, the hippopotamuses. The industries that are unsuspecting, slow, slovenly, seemingly. They spend most of their time below the glossy surface, of public view, and yet have huge importance. When it comes down to it, they are swift in consequence. They emerge from the divider that we see and create problems charging at 40 miles per hour. I talked about this in the previous video. When I talk about the hippopotamuses, I mean industries like sewage, telecommunications, electrical maintenance. They are overlooked, but without a doubt, these industries are essential. Without them, society quickly falls apart. It can't survive. There are securities that aren't talked about in the news, the sort that very quickly lead to the absence of, sanitary conditions, that lead to the festering of disease, the loss of basic communication, all sorts really that don't, power essential infrastructure, but that we need far more than sort of is expected. And no one ever talks about sewage security, because it's not a particularly attractive topic, I guess. But nonetheless, it's hugely important. We take it for granted, but were there to be a huge problem, it would be a huge problem quickly. After this, we see what they dubbed the rhinos. Industries that are really consequential when they become a problem. And these are often recognized as important within the news. So, every morning when I open the newspaper, they talk about energy. It might be stuff like energy, maybe even water supply, food production. These are issues that people perhaps avoid rather than trying to get rid of them, as they do with defense. They're problems they try to fix, not destroy the entire industry, but to an extent there is that. There is a sense that there's a little bit of destruction going on. The aim of reduction of certain, that's the plane, certain firms within these industries, particularly if they are ruled by some sort of natural oligopoly. The importance of the rhinos is recognised, but it's not as much as it should be. This might be stuff as well like satellite provision. Things that are really important, but still aren't fully inspected. They're not fully criticised in the same way that the defence industry might be. Finally, the jaguars. And this is excluding the defence industry, because they couldn't come up with an animal that would aptly fit it. The jaguars, the banks, the backers, the financiers, firms that provide monetary backing which is necessary within society. They maintain the ecosystem through taking down weaker firms and boosting conceptually stronger ones. Very quickly, society does rely, of course, upon monetary systems. It's largely built upon it, its core. And so without it, we fall apart. And without, proper flow, we do fall apart. And the reason that is a jaguar, I'm informed, is because they kill for sport, which gives nutrients to the ground, which then feeds all of the other animals, and that promotes a healthy ecosystem. In any case, why did I create this system and then make it so puerile? Who knows? Listing animals doesn't really solve problems, and I'd agree, but I think it's rather important that when we're looking at this classification, it's important to recognise the consequence of firms, that consequence isn't just consequence inherently, but the consequence that arises from combination of these little cuts that can come about through the absence of things that we need, or things that we even want. Think of it what you will, but I think that defence is often too much attacked, despite the fact that a lot of these industries are more constantly important, and important on a far shorter, far more necessitated renewal in that sort of sense. In any case, I'm mincing my words, so I'll leave it there. But I think it's worth a bit of a thought.